Okay, so here we are again. It really hasn't been to just the last couple of years that this values as a way of thinking about culture has reemerged in sociology. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what some sociologists are thinking of values now. There is one author in particular, a sociologist by the name of Steve Vaisey, V-A-I-S-E-Y, who's kind of leading the charge into this. Now, Vaisey is going back to kind of old, some 1940s and 1950s thinking about values, but he's trying to get rid of some of the problems of that, which we'll talk a little bit about next week, and bring in some new research, especially from philosophy as well as cognitive science, to say that, hey, there actually is something to this approach of values as a way to understand culture. Couple of things about what values mean in this approach. Values in this approach are kind of subconscious motivators. So this has a little bit of the feeling from Max Weber, except that there's a motivation that occurs with values. But in this framework, they're somewhat subconscious. And values, or how they work, is somewhat subconscious. And let me say a little bit more about that. Values are, and this is important, evaluative. So when people talk about values, they're really giving an evaluation of what they consider to be most important in their lives or most important in the life of a society. So what is a good person or a good society? That's what a value can mean. Like what is the right thing or the good thing to be pursuing or going after? And then Vaisey actually uses a classic definition from 1951. I'm going to insert a slide right here with that definition. And that definition tells us, quote, "A value is a conception, explicit or implicit, distinctive of an individual or characteristic of a group, of the desirable, which influences the selection from available modes, means, and ends of actions." So a value is a part of a person or a group which evaluates what is desired, what is good, what is the right for that person or that group. And then, a little bit like the model we had from Max Weber, influences the way things are done, the means of action and the ends of action. So one of the important things in bringing values back into sociology is to actually show some empirical evidence of how values might matter. And so in a cool study, this sociologist, Stephen Vaisey, picks up kind of an interesting way to think about this. He wants to look at the value of higher education. He has a data source. It's two waves. So it's a survey given to a bunch of individuals like when they're like 15 years old, that's time 1. And then they're interviewed like 8 years later, that's time 2. And he wants to see if they have a value of higher education at time 1, at time 2, does that lead to them having more education? Does it lead to them having higher education? In other words, does that value matter? So, and the supposition would be that if it's yes, then that value, having that desired evaluative end that someone is going after, has somehow change the way they interact with the world, the way they approach life, the decisions that they make in their life. So he measures kids that are like 15 and then comes back and looks at kids that are like 22 or 23. And what's really interesting is that he's able to show kind of two effects. One is that for rich kids, so in other words, for kids that have all sorts of resources, that are in great high schools, that have parents who are probably college educated, and the kids who themselves are probably going to college, different levels of valuing higher education didn't matter. So if a kid when they were 15, it was like a rich kid said, oh, I really want to go to college. I really value that. That's important. That those kids went to college. And if a rich kid didn't say that stuff, those kids still went to college. So he shows that in this study, that values didn't matter for rich kids. He argues that means that there can be social conditions in this country, especially amongst the upper middle class, where there are enough social and economic resources that whatever punch or whatever power or value has to help create a desired end isn't needed because the social and economic resources are enough. However, and this is what's interesting, he looks also at poor kids and asks them this question, and then at time 2 sees how much education they have. And he finds that poor children who at time 1 value higher education more are more likely to end up having higher education at time 2. And he says that somewhere's about 20% of the difference between poor kids who end up with higher education and those who don't, about 20% of that, he says, can be explained by those kids having values. The rest of it can be explained by, some of the poor kids had higher incomes than others, or some of the poor kids went to better schools than other poor kids. So very classic kind of hard material, social scientific reasons for differences in outcomes. But he says that about 20% of that final outcome between poor kids was due to the poor kids who articulated a value of higher education. Now I should say that seems like a lot of explanation, but it's also not a lot. It's only 1/5 of the variation amongst the poor kids from time 1. The variation in whether they got higher education at time 2 can be explained by whether a poor kid said they valued it at time 1. So that's actually not a lot of explanatory power, but it's some, and that's controversial because for, as I said earlier, about 60 years, values have kind of been ejected from sociological study, and they haven't really been considered as like a main way that something like this could happen. So it's controversial, but it's also kind of cool, right? So it's bringing in something that's intuitive to many of us, which is what you care about, what your goals are, should have some sort of impact on what happens in your life. Now, what's important from this is the answer is yes, those things can have an impact, but, they have a smaller impact than other things like income, like where you live, like who your parents are, like resources. So all these other things sociologists think about have a greater impact, but there is some role for culture in explaining an outcome like this of higher education for these poor kids. And that, in this sense, is the values that they had at a particular age. Now that leads to all sorts of interesting questions, like where do they get those values? Are they in settings, say like churches or certain school groups, or maybe certain neighborhoods where values are talked about, or where higher education is shown as something that's something that a good person does, that's something to look forward to. So there's all sorts of questions around this. We don't have like the real thick, cool story that Max Weber told us, but we do at least have some evidence that values can matter. So let me wrap up this lecture by saying that another kind of way that we hear a lot about values in kind of contemporary America is kind of talk about American values. So you'll probably see all the time in news stations and magazines and newspapers reports from surveys about how many Americans think God is important, how many Americans think family is important, how many Americans think hard work is important, yada, yada, yada. And so this is one place where we see values kind of language pop up a lot. So I want to help you kind of think about this as you go forward the rest of your life and you hear people arguing over values in school and values in politics and all this stuff. What I want to say is that a lot of the ways we hear people talk about values are rather useless. We oftentimes hear people talk as if there's lots of people who don't have values, or when you hear people talk about values voters, it makes it sound like those people who didn't vote that way don't have values. That's not the case at all. Those are political attempts to try and take try and take credit or to frame reality in a certain way, like these values are better than those values. As social scientists, what we're more interested in is going much deeper than that to look at how are values kind of distributed throughout society. What do people tend to value, or what do people tend to agree with? And so there's been some kind of cool studies of this. I'm going to post a slide right here. Which is actually from a classic study, not surprisingly, around the 1950s, which lists some, this is by a guy named Williams. He lists a whole bunch of core American values. There is another resource, and I'll put these links onto D2L, a guy named Baker, a current sociologist, who's come up with what he considers 10 core American values. And then I'll also provide another link on D2L to a survey from the Pew Forum, which is a big survey organization, where they talk about American values. So one of the useful things of this approach, and the fact that it's back reemerged in sociology, is it provides us a way to kind of give a snapshot about what it seems that Americans share in common, and where there are differences in terms of the normative dimensions of our personal and social lives. In other words, what are the things that people think that evaluate as good for themselves or as good for society? And what's neat is when you use different information in these surveys, like people's class status, educational background, race, religious beliefs, you can start to see relationships between certain values, certain definitions of what's good or what's right for individuals in society, and these other social aspects. And you can actually start to learn about some cool patterns of American life. Now, this is still kind of vague, somewhat vague and kind of overarching kind of storytelling of American society. But nonetheless, it kind of can give us these useful snapshots for how to think about the nature of society at this given moment in time. So make sure you take a look at the slide that I inserted. Those were these core values discovered by Williams back in the 1950s. And then take just a quick look at those links that I put up, just so you can poke around and you can see how analysts and how sociologists are looking at values today and using that for arguments about the nature of society. I think I can go ahead and stop right there. I think this has been an okay lecture to kind of get us into thinking about culture as values. And then next week, we're going to be a little bit more critical and a little bit more complicated. So that way, going forward in your life or in your budding career as sociologist, when anybody just uses values in a vague way, you can have a good sense of what that means, of what the concept means, and also how we would know whether or not values actually matter in social life that we observe. That's it for now. As always, please make sure to look out or to let me know any questions, and don't forget about the quiz on Thursday, which will cover 2 weeks worth of material. Okay, bye.